Good morning and welcome to our bright and early start here this morning at the meeting on the Mesa. Welcome to our panel on scaling new heights in cell and gene therapy. My name is Bill Coyle. I'm the global leader of the BioPharma vertical at ZS, and very grateful to ARM and the meeting on the Mesa for having us here today to help lead this session. So with me are four panelists. We were planning to have five, but unfortunately Taby is unable to make it this morning, but she will be at the conference for those of you that were hoping to see her. But with us, we have four panelists today. Maybe we could all introduce ourselves. Maybe Jonathan will start down your end and come this way.
Good morning. Great to kick us off. So Jonathan DeTroya, I lead strategy and partnerships for our cell and gene business at McKesson.
Morning, everybody. My name is Warner Biddle. I'm the global head of commercial at Kite. I've been there for about 3 years now and happy to be here at the ARM meeting. Thanks for having us.
Good morning, everyone. George Eastwood, board chair, interim executive director, the Emily Whitehead Foundation. Been on the board about 2 years, stepped in about a year ago as executive director. Thanks for having us here today.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Kristen Urema. I am currently serving as the president for cell therapies at Poseida Therapeutics. We are a biotech located not far away in La Jolla, and we have both cell therapy and gene therapy. We focus on allogeneic cell therapy. And we're really fundamentally a platform company with a proprietary gene editing toolkit that really underpins all of our technologies. So exciting to be here.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining me. And congrats to Kristen, effective January 1st. She'll be CEO as well. So congrats, Kristen, on your new appointment.
Thank you.
Congrats.
All right. So I'm sure no one in the room will be far into the challenges that exist in the cell and gene therapy world. So maybe just to recap a few of the key challenges we see based on research out in the marketplace and get our panelists to start diving in. So if we look at what's going on in the marketplace, this is looking at cell therapy. We see only 25% of patients that are treated with cell therapies originate outside of the treating institution. So if we think of all the people that could benefit, aren't necessarily able to benefit. Less than 50% within the institution of patients that would be eligible, in this case for CAR T therapy, actually end up getting it. So we're not getting it to the patients, even in those institutions who might be eligible for it. And interestingly, if we think about the experience that patients and their caregivers and families have in the cell therapy space, a lot of that's driven by the operations of the product, the apheresis, the waiting for the product to come back. And interestingly, 70% of treated patients don't recall getting any support from the innovators or manufacturers that created their product. So in that context, there's so much for us to be done if we think about all the amazing therapies that are going to be brought to market in the coming years. And if we think about growing the number of patients treated by an order of magnitude versus what we have today, there's lots of things that need to happen, and it'll take everyone. Providers, payers, policymakers, institutions, manufacturers, advocates, everyone in the healthcare ecosystem. And so in that context, we want to start our discussion. And maybe before we get into solutions that help us scale the impact of cell and gene therapies, maybe we want to see from the panelists what they see as the key gap in getting more eligible patients on therapies today in cell and gene. So maybe, Warner, I could start with you.
Sure, thanks. I know we're jumping right into challenges, but maybe I'll just take a quick moment and just recognize how much progress we have made. Just 6 years ago, I think some of these first constructs are being launched, Yescarta, back in 2017. I think there was a lot of questions on everyone's mind, the people working in this room and around the industry. Could we actually scale these therapies and treat more than just a couple hundred patients, and could we actually treat more than that? And the other thing was, were these therapies actually going to be enduring? And could they actually be transformative for patients? And I think you fast forward 5-6 years from now, I think the answer we've proven on both of those questions is a resounding yes, which I think is exciting. And Kite being a leader in this space with treating over 16,000 patients with Yescarta and Tecartus, we're at the forefront of that, but realize, as you summarized, I think really nicely at the beginning, that this is just the beginning, and us needing to work all together, companies that are established now, newer burgeoning companies like what you're talking about, Kristen, coming into the foray in terms of how do we expand this. And we see a number of challenges, and you kind of summarized them on the chart that you were showing a couple minutes ago here, but we see four basic issues that we need to work together as an industry on. First, of course, is manufacturing. and scaling that manufacturing so that we can meet the demand of these patients, not just now, but well into the future. There's a market access challenge as well in terms of getting the right pricing, not just here in the US, but around the world. We also see issues with regards to getting the authorized treatment centers as close as possible to patients, because we know that makes a huge difference. And then finally, and I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this, there's a huge education gap on just what the knowledge is of CAR T therapy, not just within the ATCs themselves, but in the community and with patients and practically everywhere. So I see 4 big issues from our side that we need to work together on.
Great. Kristen, maybe from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just echo and amplify, the things that that Warner has mentioned. I think a lot of these challenges we cannot work on alone. That's why we're here at meeting on the Mesa and why we have ARM to really bring this community together and, particularly work on things like policy advances. And that could be working toward regulatory frameworks and guidances that we desperately need. Could be toward educating payers and improving payment models. So there's a lot that we're going to have to work on together. I think the one area certainly that is really in focus for our company is the issue of scale, right? And how do we make sure that as many patients as possible, as deserve to benefit from these therapies, can be treated, when they need it, when the physician decides that they're a candidate for the therapy. And I think the statistics that you put up, Bill, are sad, and we should not, find them in any way acceptable as an industry. And what I find really striking is that these challenges are now, and I think it's exciting too, is that they're percolating beyond this community. I think we understand them at some level, but I'm starting to see them crop up in medical meetings as well. And the one that really sticks in my mind was this year's ASCO in Chicago, where for the first time I saw not just presentations of truly remarkable, truly brilliant, transformative data, survival data we're seeing now, right? Not just response rates, survival data. But that data would then be followed by a couple presentations from providers talking about the real world challenges that they were having, not enough manufacturing slots, having to explain to patients out of spec product. And, and those stories were focused on providing product to patients in the approved indication, right, which is late line, late line. So it just begs the question, and that was, cited many times. Well, what are we going to do when the day comes that we have therapies that are approved for early line treatment? And we're not talking about hundreds or a few thousands of patients. We're talking tens of thousands of patients, right? 15,000 patients maybe in second-line DLBCL, maybe 20,000 patients, second-line multiple myeloma. So this day is coming. How are we going to meet that need?
Great. Jonathan, anything you want to add around challenges we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think, as we, McKesson, when we speak with, different sponsors that are getting ready to launch a product into the market, we do a fair amount of research with folks that have been, the sites, during the clinical trial program. And I think one of the things that we hear time and time again is that the providers are overburdened. And so for us, it's a question of, what are the things that providers, many of them have to not only train their staff, it's very, very resource intensive from a human capital perspective and otherwise, but making that transition from a clinical trial program to then launch something commercially, they're feeling the pain, and it's a question of what are the different areas and that we can really kind of engage and relieve some of that burden, whether it be from everything from operations support to technology support to helping sites be able to run a CAR T program, let's say, in a profitable fashion. So lots to solve on the provider side, and that's going to be essential as we start to think about moving from hundreds of patients to tens of thousands of patients, right? So.
Great. So the panelists have helped summarize some of the key challenges we're seeing today. Maybe, George, you could reflect, are those the challenges you're hearing from patients, from families as well? Or are there other challenges that you see?
Yeah, I think everyone's done a great job looking at that top level. I think at the Emily Whitehead Foundation, originally it was research funding, right? A family foundation started to give back and create more Emily's, more stories, more outcomes like Tom and Carrie had. But as we've dug in deeper, you can see the bottlenecks exist within research. Creating less toxic treatments was the original theory of the foundation. But through some of the work and collaboration we're doing with ZS, how do we look at the manufacturing bottleneck pieces and what role should the patient play? And then the never-ending market access piece on the end, right? It's, we're calling that within the foundation right now healthcare delivery. It's just not something that we've done a lot of, but tangentially, Tom has been a powerful speaker at the FDA, at the European Parliament, and how can the patient voice elevate all tides, and how can the patient be at the center of the ecosystem? And in growing the foundation, how can we unite that entire ecosystem to educate as needed? I think a very important question is, what do patients need to know and when? And then what does everybody here at Meeting on the Mesa need to know from the patient that they don't hear anywhere else? So there's so many gaps within each of those bottlenecks that we need to identify them and see where could a nonprofit foundation or a patient group help, and that's just not decided yet. Companies like Kite have gaps in travel and lodging that, it's 6 or 7 years into approved therapies. Well, what role can foundations play in educating patients so that we can get them to travel that distance? And on the other end, what role can patient groups play in educating community hospitals and others? And I think Warner might have mentioned it too. It's everywhere. It's outside of cell therapy, and bringing it to the mainstream about this story, because I think there needs to be more education around what this process looks like. If you talk to patients enough, there's a story about not collecting enough T cells from a 1-year-old and needing to do a 4-hour apheresis the next day. There is, your product didn't meet spec and we can't administer it. So these are about 100 different gaps within that process in the workflow you show. How can we identify the ones that really need the most education to connect the ecosystem is where we've really been focusing over the last year or so.
Thanks for
We
that,
got a lot
George.
of work to do, George.
George,
Together.
let's do it.
I think we all do, Warner. It's probably safe to say. So we've heard the panelists share their view on some of the challenges, so now we'll get a bit more into what needs to change, or what are some of the solutions. We'll go through a couple of more questions as a panel, but then we'll also throw it open to all of you, so there'll be a microphone to go around. But after a couple more questions here, if you guys have questions, raise your hands, and there'll be a microphone to come around. We've got plenty of time to answer questions from you as well. So as we think about this challenge that was laid out, I think, Kristen, you summarized it well when we start to move in earlier lines, right? We go first line, we start to see tens of thousands of patients who could benefit and should benefit, as you highlighted, from cell and gene therapies. What are the 1 or 2 key things that we all believe need to change to make that happen? And maybe, Kristen, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for our company, we clearly see that allogeneic cell therapy is a piece of the answer. And I think it's fair to say this group knows better than anyone else. The jury has a little bit been out on, will we see allogeneic cell therapies and when, right? And will the product profile be able to measure up to what we see from the autologous cell therapies? So I'll show my cards, my stripes. I am personally a believer. I've been at a couple of allogeneic-focused cell therapy companies, including before Poseida, Atara Biotherapeutics, and we were able to get the first allogeneic T-cell therapy registered in Europe, not yet in the US. So I think the day is coming. I think we are going to see a wave of allogeneic T-cell therapies soon that are going to deliver the data from an efficacy perspective and from a safety perspective that are going to make this happen. And when that day arrives, then we will have the ability to produce at least triple-digit doses from a single batch, and to have that available readily in inventory for patients who need it. And I know McKesson because we worked with you closely on distribution system, that promise can be reality. So an allogeneic T-cell therapy could be ordered like any other pharmaceutical product and delivered using the systems, using the distribution that institutions are all familiar with, without waiting to meet the need of the patient where and when they have that. So I'm very optimistic, and do I think that will be the only solution that we need? No, I do not. I think the policy changes, work on pricing and access and equity, all of these things are also going to be important. But I think allogeneic cell therapy will help there too, because if we can manufacture at scale at a reasonable cost of goods manufactured, then we have a lot more pricing flexibility, and we're going to have the ability to deliver these kinds of transformational therapies without breaking the healthcare systems.
Thanks, Kristen. So solution one, allogeneic, as a path from Kristen's perspective. Maybe Jonathan, if you want to build on your perspective on what might be other solutions.
Yeah, and to respond a bit to some of the comments that Kristen had made here, when you think about the end-to-end, as we do at McKesson, when you think about the end-to-end kind of value chain, what it takes to actually deliver these therapies, to treatment sites, right? I think we can all agree that every step of the way it's rife with inefficiency, which is what you might expect in the beginning of making something that's innovative, right? And so for every single program, there are bespoke processes involved in every single partner that's along that value chain. And so for us, we have, I think, done a fair amount of work trying to understand what are the interrelated product flows, data flows, and financial flows, and how you can start to think about harmonizing those. Because the question is, when you start to get to allogeneic product, like why can't it be like any other specialty product that a site of care can order? I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but we could start to approximate that. And so for us, we think about it, three kind of priority areas for us are, number one, when you think about it from a supply chain perspective, how do you make this, again, as easy for the sites of care as possible? Even something as simple as ordering and then actually getting, it's not that simple, ordering and getting a product to site. And so there it's about thinking about how you can, integrate all the different kind of desperate parties involved in the supply chain. And right now, they're a bit siloed, to be completely frank, for both cell and gene therapies. But then in addition to that, how do you introduce transparency into that and visibility into the supply chain? I think that's an area that we're really interested in and keen on kind of moving forward. I think second, especially has to be in the conversation when we think about allogeneic therapies or moving from, let's say, liquid to solid tumor, is the question around coverage, market access, right? We're at a place where I think we don't have, I think we've answered the question fully. When you move from thousands to tens of thousands of patients, the efficacy results, at least from what we can see in ASCO, they're exciting. But for us at McKesson, we're interested in different kind of novel value-based agreements, for example, whether it be like a therapy warranty. These are some things that we have our eye on, and frankly, it's not a matter of bringing those to market, but how do you operationalize them? So we believe that we can be part of a solution there as well. And then the last point I'll make, which some of the panelists have already hit on, is really around not the site of care, but also patient support. So when we think about traditional, let's say, hub services, if you will, like nothing about cell and gene is conventional or traditional. And so this is an area where, as I mentioned, yes, there's inefficiency in the value chain and there's ways to introduce standardization to remove it, but that's an area where it is going to be bespoke and it has to be tailored to the needs of a program. Because frankly, when you're talking about any given program, right? The kind of education you need for that patient, kind of the support you need to provide, whether it be travel, logistics, financial support, the needs of the site of care. It's different for every single site, right? In addition to kind of the reimbursement support, both for the patient and the site of care. That's an area where we've developed, I think, significant investment in trying to understand, and we know that that is going to be a single solution every single time you implement a program. And frankly, you can architect an answer, as best you can from day one, but really it's, once you actually get into, that program and once it's after it's launched, like most of the learning is coming from those first few couple of weeks and months, and you have to be able to adapt. So maybe I give you more than two answers, but that's kind of what's on the top of our mind.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Warner or George, anything you'd like to add in terms of one or two key changes you think we need to see?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as exciting as allogeneic therapies are, and we at Kite also believe that's going to be a place in the future for future patients as well. The bottom line is, though, patients are waiting now. And I think the work that we're doing at Kite to scale autologous therapy so we can reach more patients now is a critical focus, and I think something that we wake up every day thinking about how we can do better. In fact, that's probably one of our advantages versus maybe some of the other companies in this space is this is all we do. So we wake up every day thinking about how do we make this better, how do we make this faster, and how do we get this to more patients, because we know that they're waiting. And the way we're doing that, I think, starting with the manufacturing challenge that you mentioned earlier, we've now scaled to treat thousands of patients per year. In fact, we'll now have treated over 16,000 patients, going to be close to 20,000 patients by the end of this year. We've done that through 3 commercial manufacturing sites, 2 here in the US, one just up the road up in El Segundo, just in LA, one on the East Coast as well in Maryland, and one of our other newest plants over in the Netherlands. We've also got a viral vector supply or manufacturing facility that's just down the road from here in Oceanside, because we believe the whole vertical integration of the system helps eliminate some of the issues with regards to handoffs that are critically important for these patients. So I think from a Kite perspective, the ability to scale up our manufacturing and do that consistently, we have now over a 96% manufacturing success rate for these patients, I think provides some stability, and the turnaround time at 16 days or less is now something that our customers and patients can now count on, which I think helps to bridge the gap, if you will, that you were talking about, Kristen. But we can't stop there. I think the thing that we're working on is how do we reduce that manufacturing time even further. There'll be things coming out in the next few months. We'll be making some announcements about how we're reducing that manufacturing time. And then I think there's room to go as well from a regulatory perspective on how we can actually work on the QA time and other things that we're doing in order to reduce that time. So we may not reach at some point a faster turnaround time than allogeneic therapy, but I think we can reduce it enough where patients aren't waiting, or we know patients that are signing up for these therapies and waiting for manufacturing to come and some of them expiring. How do we reduce that time so that we can, as we've seen from the data, actually show that these patients can actually get better outcomes? So that's one solution for sure. The other one, which I'll touch on briefly, is just expansion of the ATC networks themselves. We now have over 135 ATCs in the US and 350 around the world. We know that's not good enough. We need to get these into the community. You started touching on that a little bit, George. We know from our market research that as close as we can get these to patients, or if we can get these closer, they're more likely to opt for the therapy and more likely to actually go through with it when they actually sign up for it. So we know this ATC onboarding, which isn't easy. We got to partner with folks like yourselves and others to do this properly and bring these sites on quicker. Is another solution here that we can put into play to help more patients.
Right. George, anything you want to add in terms of needed solutions?
Yeah, I think everyone touched upon it in some way, but I think at the highest level, what we've been talking about, and where I've seen a lot of growth in the last year in conversations that we'd like to start at the foundation, the commonality being the patient at the top of the chain here, and really the fact that we don't care if it's allogeneic or autologous or a repurposed drug or an AAV vector gene therapy. The commonality for parents, caregivers, and patients is that they want to find cures via these transformative therapies, as Chris mentioned. So how do you integrate that into this smaller ecosystem of whether it's CAR T or ex vivo cell therapies? The answer is we need to find the cures, but we also don't want to reinvent the wheel around some other commonalities. I was talking to Dr. Grupp last week, and 50% of his time is in hematopoietic cell transplant with sickle cell, beta thalassemia, CD34 derived, because it's head of the transplant unit. How do you connect those journeys and make those learnings across the ecosystem valid? And what role can patient foundations have that? The 2 approvals we'll see hopefully by the end of the year for CD34 derived. That journey is going to look a lot like Emily's, and can the Emily Whitehead Foundation guide the conversation around there's a collection, there's an exit to manufacturing, there's an administration. So we're not sure where to limit that, and digging in deeper and understanding how those journeys map out. I think Jonathan mentioned it, there's different streams to look at from McKesson. For us, there's different streams within that patient journey, and how do we educate along the way and not forget about the mental health piece. That's one thing that has been, I'll say, somewhat alarming in my move to the nonprofit world, is the pharma company's inability to want to talk about that piece. We've seen it personally at the Emily Whitehead Foundation and some of the initiatives we've had, where it's, we can do all of that, let's just not talk about that mental health piece. And it's not just CAR T, it's any oncology, any type of life-altering diagnosis. And how can we partner further throughout that journey, which for Emily is now 11 years as a cure, but her journey is still continuing, and how do we support there? I think that's something that hasn't been thought about a lot, that really opened my eyes in the nonprofit space. How do we focus on the post-treatment, the cured patients that didn't expect that to happen? There are still challenges once you're a cancer survivor, or once you meet your goals and dreams. There's still things beyond that, and we need to work together to talk about that side too.
Well, thanks, George. Another layer on top of the sort of patient and family support needed for patients going through cell and gene therapy, and others, of course. Maybe, Jonathan, I can come to you. You started to allude to this, and of course, and Warner, you mentioned the network of ATCs you now have for your products. Today, administration's, of course, largely constrained for both cell and gene therapies to academic institutions. So what's the outlook, Jonathan, to enable practices, community to begin using these products in the future?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's funny, I think at McKesson, we're solving, distribution challenges, but that's the complete wrong way to think about it. And frankly, this is how do I solve, and how do I enable the site of care and their experience with cell and gene. And so for us, when we look in all the work that we've done so far, we know that to get a site online, it can, for any particular product, it can take upwards of 18 months, let's say. It's a burdensome process, and it really is a barrier to entry for these sites to be able to go and expand the network, as Warner mentioned. And so, today you're talking about the burdens being whether it be technology and kind of internal processes, you name it, it kind of runs the gamut, and the ability to be able to eventually kind of expand. And so when we think about, there's about 200 sites or so, probably 150 doing cell, maybe another 50 doing gene therapy today. If you look and you see where the pipeline is headed, and you see that we're going to go 10x in the number of patients that are going to be treated, let's say by the end of the decade, you're going to look at another 4x in terms of the number of sites that need to be brought online. And so it comes to this inevitability of you need to be in a position where we can be supporting not only kind of the qualification and activation of new sites, but also helping current sites and helping in their ability to kind of expand capacity. And so for us, this is a question that's very near and dear to what we're trying to solve. And so it can be something as simple as, not simple, I'll take that back, but it can be mapping this process out and introducing SOPs that can be reproducible, having a common technology platform, having a common kind of centralized place to do training. All of these solutions, we've spent a great deal of time kind of investigating, and we believe about 75 to 80% of the processes involved with activating and operating a site actually can be standardized in some form or fashion. And so for us, we see this natural progression. You start, and it's the major academic medical centers that are offering most of these therapies inpatient. You start to slowly see academic medical centers that are very, I'd say, more experienced, pushing a lot of this to outpatient and managing outpatient for certain patients. Then you start to see those academic medical centers starting to create playbooks and kind of then pushing out and looking at their satellite campuses in which they can reproduce a program. Then you start to see it moved outside the academic medical centers to your two community hospitals, and then ultimately to the community. And so for us, we want to be a part of that journey every step of the way, but for us, as our involvement obviously with the U.S. Oncology Network, we have the largest cancer, oncology footprint in the community. And so we are thinking very much today about when it comes to the community, how we can get them ready, in addition to, kind of everything, every other kind of step in between in terms of that progression that I just mentioned. It's on our minds. It should be on all our minds now. And that, to me, really solving this, the site of care and the provider kind of question is really what's going to allow us to get scaling for cell and gene. So
maybe I'll
Can
just
I add to that?
Kristen and then Warner.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that, Jonathan. I think also payer education and work with payers is going to be a critical enabler here. So when we've looked at commercializing cell therapies and allo cell therapies, payers are very excited, but they're also very concerned that the therapies be used by sites that they feel are appropriately experienced and qualified. They want their investment in the therapy to be successful. And so they will think about centers of excellence, maybe not in the way that we would think of a center of excellence of care, but their network centers of excellence where they want the therapy to be used. So in addition to just getting the sites online and trained up and everything, I think there's also another layer with the payers, which is, how can we expand over time what the payer networks really are, and how can we demonstrate that cell therapy is evolving, whether that's through establishment of protocols to manage side effects such as CRS, or just intrinsically better product profiles with a better safety profile, but that community centers really can use these therapies successfully, and so that gating and that need for referral to an expert center can be expanded or mitigated over time. So I think that's just another
Good point.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add on that because I think you touched on a really important point. A lot has changed over the last 18 months. I think the pivot point for these community health networks has been our publication and presentation of our second line data in LBCL, the ZUMA-7 data, which clearly show not only an improved progression-free survival, ERS as well, but as you mentioned, Kristen, an overall survival benefit versus the standard of care stem cell transplant, which hasn't been demonstrated for over 30 years. I think that's when the penny dropped for a lot of community hospitals. At some point they were thinking, hey, we want to treat these patients and manage these patients through our networks. But now with this data, they have a choice. They either have to say, I have to refer these patients, because there's clearly data that shows that there's a better option for these patients, or I have to learn how to use cell therapy ourselves. And I think a lot of them are opting for the second option, and we're excited to be a part of that journey with them. And I think a lot of things have changed. This FACT accreditation, which I think was the bar that was being held for a lot of these academic centers when cell therapies were initially being launched, is now being challenged. We're challenging that. In fact, I would say the KITE standards for onboarding ATCs is as high or higher than all the FACT accreditation standards that are there. So I think to your point, Kristen, I think there's a pathway forward, and we've started to onboard our first non-FACT accredited ATCs over the last few months, which I think is exciting. But more work to happen there for sure, because we have to streamline the process even further, help actually bring on board other questions beyond just the distribution and patient flow that you've outlined there. But what options can we actually provide for these community health centers in terms of alternative AFing facilities? Do they need to do that on site, or are there ways that we can leverage our AFing networks to help access and get to more patients, as well as the hospitalization for these patients themselves? Are there partnerships that we can help them put in place right now so they can help manage their patients if and when side effects occur, in addition to all the outpatient work that's happening there, which will help us increase capacity and actually allow us to treat effectively more patients. So a lot of things that I think are in play that I think 18 months ago, if you asked a lot of these centers, they probably just weren't even ready for it. But I think a lot has changed from the science perspective, a lot in terms of where the patient need is, and I think how we can approach that together as an industry has, I think, changed a lot as well. So I think exciting, some more work to be done, but a lot of ways forward, I think, on how we can do that.
So lots of discussion around thinking about expanding the footprint of where treatment can be done, making that easier, making that better. I highlighted the stat earlier today that the referral network really just isn't working either, and Warner, you mentioned the data that you have now probably cause people to think, I do need to refer if I can't do this.
Yeah.
What's holding back referral in the market today? Why aren't we seeing clinicians identifying the therapies we do have as good options and getting people referred? What do we need to do differently as we launch more? Krista?
Well, I would come back to the point that I was making before about payer access, and we think, if you're a family, a patient, you're just going to go to a center, you're not going to think, oh, is my insurance going to insist that I can only be treated at XYZ site? So, there are many other factors, but I would just amplify that one because I think that's an underappreciated dynamic here.
George, are one or other aspects of referral that's broken or needs to change?
Yeah, I think when I think about this aspect from the view of the patient, we tend to think that nothing like this has ever been done before. But we've had some conversations lately around for any cancer treatment at all in the past, you'd have to go to a comprehensive cancer center. And we've seen that spill out into the community. I live in the Boston area. There's a Dana-Farber Center at Gillette Stadium where the Patriots play, 15 minutes from my house. You don't necessarily have to go to Boston for that, right? We have a representative example. It may not be perfect, and there may be other challenges, but looking at that model and seeing how cell and gene therapy can spill out into the community to increase the potential for referral is one thing, but it's really difficult to have someone from Penn State Hershey want to refer someone to UPenn for a treatment. So we see them ramping up. I visited Hershey recently. They're offering CAR T, right? So that's a start.
Yeah.
We see so many patients that don't want to drive 3 hours to Penn for treatment, and I think we're very fortunate. When I look at Tom and Carrie's story, the way that they looked at it, Carrie was a researcher at Penn State, digging in data, that made them make that 3-hour ride. But that can't be the way that we get it into the community. We're just very fortunate that was the first step.
Yeah.
And then the referral side, it's really hard. When you come to the nonprofit side and you're dealing with patients all the time, you can get very angry, but coming from the for-profit life to begin with, we understand that there's innovation and competition and don't necessarily have an answer for it. But when we look at the clinical endpoint data that Warner mentions, that's the driving force to the front line. But some of the work being done at the foundation is what other things besides those clinical endpoints can we look at? We funded research at Penn by Dr. Hannah Schofield that is around the neurocognitive effects of CAR T. Her first paper will be coming out. How does that compare to radiation and other treatments? And could some of that psychosocial or neurocognitive behavior data actually help drive us up the chain to further push that need to refer? We're not only curing people, but they're able to be more functional, more valuable. Then you can get into your value-based care discussion around without this much neurotoxicity, the value is this much more.
Yeah.
So I think we have a chance in funding these alternative views to push towards needing to refer more, not just on the clinical data, but on that mental health, psychosocial piece too. So we've been digging in there, and it really doesn't exist. I was on the board for a year before I started digging in with Hannah and talking about the work. It's only being done at Penn. Can we expand that type of work out? Can we partner to find a way to look beyond clinical endpoints to make referral 100% have to happen beyond any business case that the different sites can argue?
Yeah. I just can't believe that he stuck a Gillette Stadium in a Patriots reference in the start.
I'm a Giants fan.
He's obviously a true fan.
I'm a Giants fan.
Oh, there you go. That
point
makes
to
more
their-
sense now.
I have a question for you, George. So
Sure.
within the patient community, do you see patients and families encouraging each other to refer? So do you see a dialogue there that supports referral? Like, hey, this will be worth it if you do make the trek? Or, is that not a dynamic? I just wonder if that's an opportunity.
Yeah, we'll probably touch on this a bit later in trust and AI part of the conversation, but so many of these conversations happen in Facebook groups behind the scenes. I'm privy to some of them, but even I feel like I'm intruding having not been through this. But the amount of encouragement you see from the groups, it can have such an impact on the industry. That's a question we're asking. How do we create more public communities of these patients? They really do push each other. You can speak to what a zealot Tom is for CAR T therapy, and just when I started digging into the foundation, the many stories of people calling him directly, and depending on the view of the parent, it's 100%. How do you magnify that effect? So the one thing, when I dug further in the foundation work, was we could never scale Tom. Tom can't be everywhere. He would have been here today if he wasn't giving another talk. He'd be here instead of me on stage, most likely, motivating everyone. But how can we magnify that? So there are so many patients that came to me that said, Tom got us in here. He set up this appointment with Dr. Grupp. That's just unscalable, but that type of passion and enthusiasm exists. So what we've worked on is, rather than being competitive in the last month for Childhood Cancer Month, we've actually, some of the patients that Tom's helped get into CAR T, we've seeded their nonprofit dreams to help their local families in their area. One patient, the Keller family, Oakland, an amazing story in Ohio, 2,000 people in town and 4 children have ALL. So Luke came in and gave a talk with us at the CAR TCR Summit. He joined us for a private event last week where he talked about this. We issued a grant kind of forced him to start his foundation and said, we can't help those 4 families, but you know the story, you dig into the data, can we help in that way? And that collaborative atmosphere is so present in what we're trying to do with the foundation. But like all business, even the nonprofit world can be so competitive. So how do we use that patient voice? And it's just a shame that all of you on stage don't get to see that piece. But how can the foundation push that out and see how passionate people are that have been through this? And how can we create those conversations with different patients on here?
We'd like to see that, because that'd be motivating, I think, for all of us if we could somehow see that. The truth is we're changing a paradigm here, and there's a huge educational issue that we need to overcome, and we're kind of touching on it, but I mean, even just these community physicians that we're talking about that are treating a lot of these patients in the initial stages, their view on CAR T therapy may be 5, 6, 7 years old. The initial thoughts on CAR T was this is really toxic, it may work, we're not really sure it's gonna work, and it's a huge hassle to actually give it to patients. We know a lot of those things have actually changed. We know we've got curative data. We know actually we have better ways of actually managing the side effects, and a lot of support systems in place now where we can identify patients early and help them through their journey. The truth is that we know from our market research, though, that patients find out about these therapies sometimes way too late. A lot of times community physicians are saying, I don't even want to tell them about CAR T because I don't want them to worry about that right now. Where in fact, actually, they should be giving them the options so they can be thinking about with their caregivers and families on how do they plan around this if and when they need it. And it's actually a source of hope we're actually seeing from the market research about them finding about it early, but a lot of times they don't. And then there's an education component, like I said, with the physicians themselves about identifying the right patient, identifying them early enough. And even as you touched on a little bit, Kristen, how is presented to that patient can make a huge difference as to whether the patient will say, yeah, I'll go forward with that, or maybe I'll just stick with something else here in the community and stick with that. So I think there's a lot of progress that's been made, because I think, 5, 6 years ago, we didn't have any of these patients being treated, but now, and you touched on a little bit this at the beginning, we're only seeing in our Kite research 2 out of 10 eligible patients that could be eligible for CAR T actually getting it. So we know that is just horribly too low. In fact, if you look at our European countries that have different payer and healthcare systems from a referral perspective, we know that number could be as high as 4 or 5 out of 10. So we know there's a huge opportunity here in the US, a huge opportunity where patients are waiting, but it's these education issues, and it can't be just coming from organizations and companies. We have to all work together on this, but I think there's a huge opportunity to change that.
And maybe just I think Warner hits the nail on the head. From our lived experience, I think there's tremendous opportunity to educate community physicians, and like a CAR T is seen as the last resort, at least in the minds of much of the community, and so tremendous opportunity to educate there and to help. I think replace some of that knowledge, which may be 5, 6 years old. So I think the statistics you just gave, 2 out of 10. I mean, it resonates because this is what we talking to community day in and day out. I mean, we hear the stories, and so a lot of things that we're already doing there, but tremendous opportunity, and I think that's one big piece to solving the referral pattern. To be completely frank,
we're getting fired up too.
Yeah, I'm getting fired up. It's right in my my zone here.
And data should help too, right? So the more and more we generate data, starting in the outpatient setting, which I think we're all studying, but then just with a wider swath of centers and showing that experience with these therapies in the community setting can be successful. That's just another way. We need the narrative, we need the voices, and then we need some facts and data experience to back it up.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen, right, every parent is different. So if we're going to create a portal of information for CAR T, sometimes the husband and wife don't want to read the same portal. So we've had some focus groups discussing that. Just tell me everything's going to be fine. And then the other one is, I'll mention Luke Keller again. We've been spending some time chatting with him, getting papers from China and having them professionally translated to look for the specific mutation that his daughter had. It can be at that level, where patients dig in that deep. And that's one piece that was very interesting for me to find. But on the other end, we have to meet them where they are. So there has to be multiple levels of education based upon how the patient and how the parent would be, sometimes in the same household. But touching to the community education piece, the doctors need to be met where they are too. If it's this transformative therapy and we use this innovation word all the time, there's going to be certain doctors that stay away. I think you mentioned it, Warner, and others. If it's that new and innovative, that's not their style. But what if this research-heavy person goes and meets that doctor?
Yeah.
Right.
What happens then?
How do we translate and bring them to?
How do we translate?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, that ends up being that patient doing research, finding out about the Whitehead Foundation or someone else that went through CAR-T. So that's where seeding other charities to get more of them out there locally for us is just a strategy for this year. Perhaps if there's someone close enough that you could call that went through it. So we've been talking to the Opie Foundation in London. She, 1-year-old, going through the consecutive days of apheresis, but in the UK, through a commercially approved Kymriah. So drastically different than what Emily gave through, but at least we can, it's kind of a referral process of, oh, you're from the UK, could you talk to Lucy Jones? She's been through Kymriah in the UK, totally different payer system, totally different everything. So trying to connect those dots, but how do we educate universally when there's such a different view
point,
at every community hospital, every major piece? There's about 100 different personalized education programs we have to put together. How can we partner with industry to put those stories together in front of everyone as soon as possible to
The patients, you're right, can be a huge, powerful voice. We know patients that have gone through stem cell transplant and then unfortunately had to ask CAR-T as well, and you ask them, they would rather do CAR-T. The stem cell transplant is really, really difficult therapy for these patients to make, but that's not what the perception is for the average patient out there, or even maybe how it's being presented to them in terms of their options. So the patient voice, patients that have gone through it can be advocates for others, not only in terms of the treatment choice, but to your point on how to navigate the whole system. So I think there's more to be tapped into there.
Sure.
For sure.
And we're talking now, or we have been talking about patients and families, and then physicians and their institutions, but let's also remember the bigger picture with policymakers and payers, right? So an important enabler is making sure that there is actually access to the therapies from a reimbursement perspective. And so policymakers are also people. They may also have not great familiarity with these advanced therapies, or the information that they have is older.
Yeah.
And so that's where, again, organizations like ARM, are doing extensive work with, there's a legislative fly-in day every year, and those efforts are extending to Europe as well, and working with EMA, where right now we're facing really significant, hurdles to reimbursement and access in some countries. So I think the education theme is a broad one and requires many different groups to be working with all the different stakeholders in the healthcare system.
I think reflecting on the work, Kristen, I've done in the payer space over the last 6-8 years around cell and gene therapies, I think we tend to have a cynical view of payers for good reasons coming out of traditional biopharma. But the actual interest in the innovation, the interest in the patient impact, the willingness to figure out how to make my system work to deal with this new way of working, it's there.
Yeah.
It's hard to execute on sometimes, but I think that's important for us all to remember, is the things that all of you and you guys are bringing to market are attractive to payers when they deliver amazing patient value. Any questions? We're running through the time really quick here. Maybe we'll take a question from the front.
My question is John Roberts, Opportunics. What's the biggest blind spot in manufacturing where innovation is lacking that really needs to be solved or worked on?
So let me just repeat the question. I think there's online folks, so they might not have heard the question. So in terms of what's the biggest blind spot in manufacturing when it relates to scaling, where we are in getting more therapies out there. So I'll probably turn that to our manufacturing friends. Warner, maybe start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think we've been addressing that from a Kite perspective really well over the past few years. Just getting the actual number of slots built and build it to capacity. And you have to think about it. Your manufacturing slots are your inventory. We can't store these cells and manage these cells in the way we traditionally think about pharmaceuticals. So we at Kite build extra slot and slot availability so that there's choice to match when patient demand is going to happen. We're also using, and I know maybe we'll touch on this at some point, or maybe we won't have time, but we're using artificial intelligence now to manage our slot capabilities and understand the demand, because the demand is obviously fluctuates a lot. For some reason, patients love to get AIFed, or more centers want to AIF patients on Friday, but a lot of deliveries happen Tuesday, Wednesday, so we have to manage that within the context of the system, and we've got to level load that across all the different manufacturing facilities that we have. So the first thing is building the scale. The second, I think, is building the capacity and the capabilities within that to manage the slot availability across the different parts of your network. And then, as we say at Kite, volume is your friend, because I think over time, multiple indications, multiple sites, multiple locations around the world, you can start to get that volume, drive down the cost of goods, but also find a way to do it in a more efficient way while still maintaining that great customer and patient care and flexibility for these patients that need it in that timely manner.
I've got two for you, because you said blind spot. So blind spot is by definition what we're overlooking or what we're not seeing. And so one is, I think, we talk a lot about capacity constraints and whether that's increasing capacity within manufacturers to meet the need, or trying to take an allo approach like we're doing. So we hear about the manufacturer side of things a lot, but I think we don't hear about the provider side. And apheresis is not a simple procedure. It's not a 20-minute blood draw and you get a sticker and a donut and you go on your way, and it's
You eat donuts?
all the
Only when she gives
time.
blood.
It's a 4 to 8 hour procedure, depending. So it's a real commitment, and it takes time. So to me, a blind spot is there's not enough focus and understanding of how the logistics and management on the provider side work. We will hear people say, I just can't tie up my suite to apheresis, to apherese all these patients, even if I wanted to. It's just too time consuming. I don't have the capacity. So what does that mean? Does that mean, scaling those facilities within the institutions? Or does that mean I need to figure out another approach? And then I think a second is, you guys have heard me, I'm obviously a big believer in allogeneic cell therapy. But we talk about the manufacturing of that kind of like it's a given and it's going to happen, right? We're going to reach these incredible yields, and but it's kind of a black box, and a miracle occurs, and in a few years we're going to be there. And that is not necessarily that easy. Different types of cells, allo is not allo. Different types of cells are very different in their ease of growing and scaling. And I think there's maybe not enough attention on what does it really take to successfully manufacture at the needs that are going to be required. So at Poseida, we put a lot of energy into working on a technology that we call booster molecule that really supports growth as well as purification and all the downstream optimization to be able to actually make those high yields happen. So we feel we've got a good angle on that, and we've been talking about being able to produce triple-digit doses from a single batch. But I do think that's like the promise part of allo, where we really need to see that pulled through and the delivery.
All right, so we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to end with an optimistic question for our panelists. So if we look back 10 or 15 years, what we have today is almost akin to magic versus what we could give patients. So now let's carry it forward another 15 years. What are our panelists excited about? If we look back on today, 15 years from now, what are we going to be most excited about? So Kristen started as a researcher in the space a couple of decades ago. Then she moved into regular pharma. Now she's back in cell therapy. So perhaps, Kristen, you can kick us off with what we're going to be excited about in 15 years.
Thanks, Bill. No, you're right. It's kind of full circle. So I started way back when, trained as a bench researcher. So I'm a Ph.D. by training, and kind of a mashup of cell culture engineering and drug discovery in a chemical engineering department before we really had anything like this. And people doing crazy things like sending cells up into space and seeing if they would organize into functional tissues, and growing matrices that looked like ears on the back of mice. And there's probably not that many of us who are old enough here to remember that, but maybe some of us. And so I was always excited about the potential of cell and gene therapy, but it just seemed a very, very long way off. And so that's where my personal career journey took me, into pharma and through lots of different TAs and lots of different functional areas. But having had the opportunity to come back to cell and gene therapy in the last 3-4 years, it's felt like coming home. And so I'm excited that we are where we are. I'm excited that we have approved therapies that work, that are transformative, that are changing the lives of patients and their families. And I am excited that we will have many, many more. And that hopefully someday the number of patients who deserve to benefit from these therapies will be able to do so.
George.
Yeah, I think Chris and I were talking about it right before the session. For me, I went to pharmacy school originally and ended up in C&GT cell supply, providing a lot of the phase 1 material for Allogene, Pfizer, all of them. So, my dream is, I say, when I'm 70, if we can get diagnosed, walk downstairs and be handed a vial of allogeneic cells. Got about 28 years to get that done. But you said 10 to 15 years.
We'll shoot for your 60th.
Yeah, so if you say 10 to 15 years,
Bring it in a little bit.
yeah, I think it's that conversation that auto and allo need to exist, but for the right indications, for the right patients, that allo is an option that we can manufacture at a larger scale. Don't want to get into all the challenges of identifying donors for cGMP production. That's another career of mine that moved past, but it is all of these different modalities curing what % of the 400,000 children diagnosed each year with cancer, right? So 15 years from now, hopefully there's cell therapy is a lot larger chunk. Auto will most likely be a larger chunk, but allo will be hopefully on its way up as we increase persistence and so on. So moving towards that, I think they'll all exist, but 10 or 15 years, could we just take a larger chunk of that 400,000 and treat them with a transformative therapy that's less toxic than radiation and chemotherapy?
Great. Warner.
Yeah, well, Kite's excited to be leaders in this space right now, but working with all of you, as you guys have touched on, continuing to expand these therapies for more patients moving forward. So for us, what I'm really excited about is getting these therapies into earlier lines of therapy. We were talking about our second-line data, but we're now looking at first-line trials and how to even advance the outcomes that we see for patients. The earlier and the more nascent T cells that these patients have seem to generate better outcomes, so that for us is extremely exciting. We're working on next generation Yescartas, because as good as this product is, we know that we need to actually expand on that efficacy platform and actually improve on the safety profile. So we've got next generation bicistronics, CD19, CD20s that are in the clinic right now that are doing remarkably well, which is exciting. We're also really looking forward to our partnerships and expanding into multiple myeloma, which again is a largely unserved space right now, even with the constructs that are in the market right now. And we believe with our manufacturing, we can help more patients as well moving forward. And then I think longer term, I think as all of us seen, we've been talking about cell therapies within the confines of oncology for such a long time, but the autoimmune data, which I think everyone has seen by now, is transformative, at least in these dozens or so patients that we've seen it now treated in. So Kite will be a part of that story as well, but I think again, working across the industry about how do we expand the promise of these cell therapies and CAR T therapies to even more patients in autoimmune diseases and others that I think can change the lives of these patients, which I think is extremely motivating. So lots to come.
Thanks, Warner. Jonathan.
Yeah, and I think, just speaking, I think like most of you in the room here, I've spent my entire career in healthcare, and I, began my journey in public health, and then eventually went to medical school. So for me, everything is about the patient foremost. That's how I'm centered, and that's frankly how a lot of our team at McKesson is centered as well. And so to that point, I think we're at the beginning of a paradigm, right? I sat in ASCO, and the public health person in me looked at the Kaplan-Meier curves and saw some of the efficacy results, and am marveled by it. And so I think for us, we're fortunate where we can bring scale, and we can bring and introduce standardization. And so for us, the question I'm trying to solve, and frankly have committed my career now to solving, is how do we democratize cell and gene? How do we do that? That's what I get up every day and think about. That's kind of what the rest of the McKesson team does as well. And so for us, 15 years, I can't even contemplate what that looks like, but I think we're now at a point where we can stop asking the questions of, is this really going to start to scale? Is this going to, does this really have, teeth? And that's inevitability at this point, looking at the clinical efficacy data that we're seeing. Now it's a question of how do we make it happen from an operational, a payer perspective, you name it. And so we're a part of that equation, and we recognize we can't do it on our own. You all are a part of that equation as well. And so what I spend my days thinking about is how do I bring the right partners to the table to get us to that path. So.
Great, thanks. So a lot of topics we didn't get to as a group: AI-driven patient identification, health inequities and how we attack them, the role of advocates. So I'm sure as you see our panelists around the rooms the next couple of days, they'd be more than happy to chat about any of those topics. Leave us with that optimistic note. In 15 years, we get diagnosed, we walk downstairs, cell and gene therapy has been democratized. We can get apheresed and treated 2 weeks later or get it right off the shelf. So that's our plan. And all of you are helping bring that to reality as well. So thanks so much for your time, and thanks to our panelists.
Thanks, Bill.